Political Economy Lecture 1. What were some of the principles upon which the welfare state was built? The state should serve economic and social functions to maintain the population's welfare. Key tasks include providing social insurance or pensions that protect the elderly and disabled, as well as unemployment insurance that protect those who can't find work, and healthcare for citizens. The idea is to protect vulnerable populations. 2. Provide 3 theoretical reasons for the emergence of the modern welfare state. Welfare states emerge because of cultural changes, industrial capitalism, international/regional learning effects. 3. Economic performance can be measured many ways. GDP, PPP, GNI. Gross domestic product. GDP growth. GNI growth. Economic measures sometimes measure quality of life, standard of living, access to freedoms and opportunities, or other indicators. 4. 2D. The most common indicators include GDP, GNI, and PPP. 5. Measures of political economy slides. There are 2 of them: inequality, Gini coefficient, inflation and hyperinflation, and using Hungary as an example. Inequality due to differences in access to resources, including income, power, or status, or the differential distribution of access to goods like power, status, and material resources. Inequality due to income inequality. Some societies have incomes that are distributed very equally across people, while other countries have incomes that vary dramatically between different people. The most common used measure of inequality across an entire population is the Gini coefficient, which measures how much of a society's wealth, or income, is held by what percentage of the population. Usually expressed as a number between 0 and 1. Hungary was one of the worst examples of hyperinflation during the year of 1945 to 1946. After World War II, it left the country economically devastated, and Germany never repaid their debt to Hungary. On top of that, the country had to pay reparations to the Soviets. Reparations reached nearly half of all revenues, and as a result, hyperinflation set in. This caused the prices to double every 15 hours. 6. Case for market versus state-led economy. The United States is an example of a country whose economy has a market-based economy. A. Always been the leader in the world. B. Never been subjected to state regulation because it is free market. C. Grown powerful and dynamic, but with variations in performance over time *. D. Grown faster than that of Europe at each stage in the 20th century. Market economy and neoliberalism under the title, Markets and Economic Performance, Market-Led Economy, Adam Smith. Cultural Changes Theory, Add Welfare State. The profits of a French firm operating in Senegal add to the GDP of this state and the GNI of this state. Adam Smith. A. France, France. B. Senegal, Senegal. C. France, Senegal. D. Senegal, France. Adam Smith's concept of the invisible hand refers to invisible hand of market is best path, Adam Smith, one of the pioneers of market-led development/approach. Through the individual efforts of people seeking only their own well-being, society as a whole is made better off. Privatization is the key, transfer of control of business, industry or service from public to private sector. Centralized planning by states quite often fails. Liberalize markets and let private sector run economy. State. Characteristics of modern state: impersonality, bureaucracy and sovereignty. 12. Discuss 2 reasons for the revival of authoritarianism. 13. Welfare state, what it is and how it emerged. Welfare state, a state that aims to provide a basic safety net for the most vulnerable elements of its population, often accomplished through social insurance, pensions and public healthcare plans. It emerged in the 20th century after some countries, example, France and Germany, experimented with social insurance toward late 19th century, based on the following principles. The state should serve economic and social functions to maintain the population's welfare. Key tasks include providing social insurance or pensions that protect the elderly and disabled, as well as unemployment insurance that protect those who can't find work, and healthcare for citizens. 14. The three theories that describe the rise of the welfare state. Cultural changes. Welfare states emerge because of changing values and norms. For example, earlier states did not develop a social safety net because nobody really wanted them to. This is because other institutions were regarded as more suitable to the provision of welfare before 19th century. Industrial capitalism. Industrial capitalism creates welfare states. This makes sense given that the welfare state is typically described as a state that responds to problems produced by capitalist development. Industrial capitalism has led to massive economic growth, but it has also generated social and economic changes that have proved dislocating to many people and many societies. International/regional learning effects. Welfare states in some countries and regions serve as models for those elsewhere. We will not fully understand how welfare states emerged and took shape around the world if we think about countries in a vacuum. This means countries may alter their welfare states based on experiences they observe elsewhere because other countries may provide examples of good practices or cautionary tales about what not to do. 15. Why do modern states emerge? Bellicist theory. Political/conflict theories aka Bellicist theory. States' rise was a consequence of conflict, meaning it war made the state, Charles Tilly, so interstate wars were decisive in creation of the modern state. For states to rise, they have to figure out how to do three things. 1. Centralized authority. Political administration must be centralized, which meant feudalism had to go. 2. Ability to tax population to raise revenue. Administrating a modern state costs lots of money, and until states get good at taxing its citizenry, it cannot do very much. 3. Ability to mobilize population for collective projects. Economic theories. Do not ignore the role of geopolitical conflict, but their proponents think economic modernization is the fundamental cause of the rise of modern state. Marx was a fierce advocate of this idea. States are a reflection of underlying economic interests. The modern state simply represents the interests of bourgeoisies, the owner of the capital. These capitalists create the state as an organization so that they can manipulate the circumstances that will maximize their profits, which ultimately, from this point of view, means exploiting labor, the alternative anarchism. Capitalist classes favor rise of states because stable state maximizes profit potential, allowing exploitation of labor, e.g. However, not all proponents of economic theories of the state have a Marxist or left-wing perspective. Diffusion theories in Western Europe. Diffusion, the process through which an idea or practice spreads locally, nationally, and globally. It was not foregone conclusion that everywhere would end up with states. Question: why did the state as a form of organization spread around the world? 16. Discuss at least two ways in which diffusion theory explains the rise of the modern state. Why and how did the state come to be the dominant way of doing politics everywhere? Theory. States had military advantages over non-states and thus came to dominate politics everywhere. Theory. States reflected needs of economic interests that pushed for state creation everywhere. Theory. State organization became an important idea or cultural reality that took root everywhere. 17. Bolsa Familia in Brazil, E.G. Social welfare program of the Brazilian government, part of a network of federal assistance programs. Bolsa Familia provides financial aid to poor Brazilian families. If they have children, families must ensure that the children attend school and are vaccinated. International learning effect. 1. What were some of the principles upon which the welfare state was built? It emerged in the 20th century after some countries, example, France and Germany, experimented with social insurance toward late 19th century, based on the following principles. The state should serve economic and social functions to maintain the population's welfare. Key tasks include providing social insurance or pensions that protect the elderly and disabled, as well as unemployment insurance that protect those who can't find work, and healthcare for citizens. 2.11. Unlike neoliberals, proponents of state interventionism believe that markets are unlikely to generate national wealth on their own. 3. State interventionism. State argument. Theory: high-quality state interventions can spur development, while low-quality states harm it. It protects key industries from foreign competition. Unlike neoliberals, proponents of state interventionism believe that markets are unlikely to generate national wealth on their own. Quality and nature of state involvement matters more than just quantity of state involvement. China's development. Many state policies can promote successful industry. These policies may include various ways of protecting local businesses from foreign competition, especially in the early stages of development when a country is trying to build up its infant industries. They may also involve direct state investment in important industries, such as steel, or incentives or advantages provided to private businesses, such as low-interest loans to build factories. States are needed to provide important public goods. 11. Unlike neoliberals, proponents of believe that markets are unlikely to generate national wealth on their own. A. State interventionism. B. Capitalism. C. Laissez-faire liberalism. D. Embedded autonomy. 4. Capitalism. The case for a market argument. Free markets are basis for creating wealth. Market efficiently allocates resources, while state impedes growth with meddling. Invisible hand of market is best path. Adam Smith, one of the pioneers of market-led development/approach. Through the individual efforts of people seeking only their own well-being, society as a whole is made better off. Privatization is the key, transfer of control of business, industry or service from public to private sector. Centralized planning by states quite often fails. Liberalize markets and let private sector run economy. The idea that society benefits from economic efficiency and expansion generated by individual gains. The idea that government should not interfere with the operation of the market. The idea that government's role is to establish a rule of law and protect property rights. Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations, 1977. We are rational actors and behave the same, so let us be. This logic has been extended to world economy as well. Neoliberal economists commonly hold that government intervention in the economy results in inefficiencies and losses to society as a whole. 7. A country that was a leading example in demonstrating the potential successes of state-led development in the period after World War II was 8a. The United States. 9b. The United Kingdom. 10c. Japan. 11d. Germany. Authoritarianism. 12. Discuss 2 reasons for the revival of authoritarianism. There are 2 causes for the present revival of authoritarianism. Greater level of sophistication of some authoritarian regimes. Growing internationalization of confrontation between democratic and authoritarian regimes. The first is related to the greater level of sophistication of some authoritarian regimes. For example, Shabazz, 2008, work shows that the Communist Party of China has allocated hefty budgets to carefully examine and study the reasoning behind the Soviets' downfall, thereby using those lessons to the cause of its survival. The second is the growing internationalization of confrontation between democratic and authoritarian regimes. This has been marked by the readiness of some authoritarian regimes to intervene in internal affairs of others, paralleling the efforts of Western governments to spread democracy. Saudi Arabia, the Persian Gulf states, Venezuela, and Russia have all done this. Ferdinand, et al., 2019, page 112. While the 1990s saw widespread democratization, the period since has been a revival of authoritarianism, example, in Egypt and Venezuela, which compels some scholars to claim that democracy is at present in retreat globally. Kurlansik, 2013. 13. Types of authoritarian regimes: totalitarianism, theocracy. Which of the following regimes could be described as bureaucratic authoritarian regimes? 14a. The United States in 2010. 15b. Argentina in the 1970s. 16c. Iran after the 1979 revolution. 17d. There has never really been a bureaucratic authoritarian regime. Note, other examples, Chile and Brazil in 1970s. 18. Why do authoritarian regimes emerge and persist? Provide two theoretical explanations formulated by scholars of comparative politics. Poverty and inequality. State weakness and failure. Political culture theories of authoritarian persistence. Elites and non-democratic rules. Poverty and inequality. Theory, high levels of poverty or income inequality lead to more authoritarianism. Theoretical. If we accept modernization theory's explanation of democratization, that economic development causes societies to become more democratic, we would expect the obverse to be true as well. Factors like economic collapse, increasing poverty, and increasing income inequality likely predict a turn toward authoritarianism, and ongoing economic stagnation and poverty likely predict authoritarian persistence. Poverty leads populists to greater concern with economic issues than political liberties. Poor masses and radical authoritarians may favor populism and redistribution. If you are worried about where your next meal is going to come from or how to access healthcare for your ill children, you are less likely to devote your energy to demanding the right to vote or pursuing political liberties. Some needs strike us more immediate than others. All in all, such theories emphasize the often authoritarian consequences of poverty and inequality. State weakness and failure. Theory, states with weak or failing institutions are likelier to have authoritarian regimes or authoritarian persistence. Well-institutionalized states tend to be less personalistic and more resistant to efforts of private actors to co-opt them for their own gain. Weak institutions often result in more predatory states or regimes, where one group in society is able to capture the state and use it for the group's own benefit. Less capable of being totalitarian, but may be likely to have other forms of authoritarianism. State failure or state weakness itself can happen for a reason, e.g., low economic development. Democracy. Huntington 3 waves of democratization. Huntington, the third wave, democratization in the late 20th century, 1991. Samuel Huntington observes that democracy takes place in waves. He identifies 3 major waves of democratization, from 1828 to 1926, 19th century slow wave, from 1943 to 1961, and from 1974 until the 1990s. Pointed to the multiple factors but drew particular attention to 2 types of external or systemic factors. External factors such as the EU, the US, and the Catholic Church under John Paul II in fomenting democratization. For example, the U.S. changed its policies in the late 1970s under Jimmy Carter, arguing that a respect for democracy and human rights needed to be emphasized alongside national interests. In the 1980s under Ronald Reagan, the National Endowment for Democracy was established, designed to assist global democratization. Another force was a process of snowballing in which democratizing regimes influences one another through example. Successful democratization in one country shows that democratization is possible elsewhere. It also provides models for how to achieve the transition. During each democratic wave, demonstration effects might even present pressure to democratize as authoritarian forms come to seem less legitimate. If India is poor and still a democracy, does this disprove modernization theory on democracy? As a low-income democracy, India is a deviant case that can help us clarify and/or amend the nature of the original theory on democracy and modernization. What if modernization theory is not making the law-like generalization that development leads inevitably to democratization, but rather a weaker claim that economic development facilitates democratization and democratic consolidation? Why would this be different? Because the theory would now say that it is unlikely that India would successfully democratize without first achieving a higher level of economic development, but not that it's impossible. A more flexible theory of modernization might be compatible by including insights from other theories. For example, perhaps modernization theory on democracy can be linked to theory on parliamentarism, parliamentary democracies and democratic success, to seek an alternative answer when the society in question, in this case India, has a relatively low level of economic development. India, as a deviant case, like any deviant case, is useful as it helps us to critically assess existing theories or modifying them. Liberal democracy as a representative democracy. Liberal democracy as a version of representative democracy combines the ideology of liberalism, which advocates a high level of individual freedom, individual autonomy and limited government, with a democratic system of governing based on the election of representatives. Principles. Limits on what governments can do. Freedom of expression and organization. Freedom for communications media. Free competition for political power, Ferdinand, et.al., 2018. Asterisk defining feature of liberal democracies, the powers of government are limited by law. Under the slide types of democratization, democratic transition or democratic consolidation. Democratization, the process of a regime becoming more democratic, including both democratic transition and democratic consolidation. Democratic transition. Changes from one regime type, authoritarianism, to another, democratic rule. Democratic transition, process, whether gradual or rapid, through which a non-democratic polity becomes democratic. Democratic consolidation. Naturally a longer-term process than transition. Process by which a new democratic order becomes institutionalized, the process through which democracy, once achieved, is strengthened. It is when democracy and its political and civil rights become normal or habitual for citizens. The term consolidation has been characterized as happening when democracy is the only game in town, when there are no major political groups advocating for a return to authoritarianism or for the overthrow of the democratic system. Democratic transitions in the 1970s and 1980s were predominantly located in what regions? A. Latin America, Southern Europe, and Central Eastern Europe. B. Western Europe, Latin America, and Sub-Saharan Africa. C. North Africa, Southeastern Asia, and Latin America. D. Sub-Saharan Africa, the Caribbean, and Central Eastern Europe. Democratic transitions in the 1970s and 1980s predominantly took place in Latin America, Southern Europe, and Central Eastern Europe. Stronger democratic international norms have contributed most directly to an increase in legitimacy for all regime types. B. A response of an increase in authoritarianism. C. A rejection of international law. D. An increase in regimes defined as hybrids. 1. What do political scientists mean by the term democratic breakdown? Provide 2 real-life examples. Essay questions. 1. Briefly explain what the term development means. Identify and explain at least 4 ways of measuring development. Which of these, if any, is the most important measure? Explain why, in your view, this is the case. Next, explain the theories of modernization and neo-modernization, also known as post-materialist theory, in terms of 3 of their most important characteristics. How do their respective theorists understand economic development? In the case of each of these theories, discuss at least 2 ways. Explain 2 ways in which the 2 theories might be critiqued. Which theory do you find more plausible and why? If neither, explain why. Development. A process by which a society changes or advances, often measured in terms of economic growth, but also sometimes measured in terms of quality of life, standard of living, access to freedoms and opportunities, or other indicators. Development is measured invariably as economic growth. The most common indicators include gross domestic product, GDP, total market values of all goods and services produced in a country and in a year's time, the most common and basic measure of a country's economic activity. GDP at purchasing power parity, PPP, accounts for cost of living. It measures how much a dollar buys in a given place. Gross national income, GNI, total income from all goods and services earned by a country's producers, regardless of where they operate. Which of these, if any, is the most important measure? Explain why, in your view, this is the case. The most comprehensive measure of overall economic performance is gross domestic product or GDP, which measures the output or total market value of goods and services produced in the domestic economy during a particular time period. GDP is probably the best measure of the overall condition of the economy because it includes the output of all sectors of the economy. It is common to use the quarterly real GDP series, nominal GDP adjusted to remove the effects of inflation, to determine the timing of business cycle expansions and recessions. Explain the theories of modernization and neo-modernization, also known as post-materialist theory, in terms of three of their most important characteristics. How do their respective theorists understand economic development? In the case of each of these theories, discuss at least two ways. Explain two ways in which the two theories might be critiqued. Which theory do you find more plausible and why? If neither, explain why. The model postulates that economic development occurs in 5 basic stages, of varying length. Modernization as a predetermined process. Walt Whitman Rostow's, 1961, The Stages of Growth, a Non-Communist Manifesto. All countries in the world must go through these stages in order to become fully modern, and by implication, politically and economically developed. Traditional, pre-takeoff, take-off, drive to maturity, and mass consumption. Post-materialist society rests on the presupposition that once a society reaches a certain level of socio-economic development and technical/industrial achievement, it turns its attention to issues and concerns that lie beyond the attainment of economic and physical security, in this case the satisfaction of purely material needs. These issues and concerns are related to post-material values, bound up in principles, attitudes, and beliefs such as democracy, gender equality, environment, and human rights. Post-materialist theory, post-material values such as freedom of expression, human rights, gender equality, quality of life, and the environment are given greater priority by those who grew up in the relative security and affluence since World War II. 2. Define two competing definitions of authoritarianism and explain why this concept is so complex. Why do some political scientists argue that we are in an age of authoritarian revival? Next, name and briefly explain 4 general characteristics all authoritarian regimes have in common. Identify 5 major types of authoritarian regimes and provide examples. Explain each in reference to at least 3 of their characteristics. Next, name and explain 4 major theories of authoritarian rule. What 2 key arguments does each theory offer to explain authoritarianism and its persistence? 2 competing definitions of authoritarianism. We can conceptualize authoritarianism in 2 ways. A. As a form of government that is non-democratic. Put differently, what defines authoritarianism is what it is not, i.e., democratic. Ferdinand, 2019, page 112. B. These non-democracies manifest themselves in political regimes that are controlled by a small group of individuals who exercise power over the state without being constitutionally responsible to the public. Why do some political scientists argue that we are in an age of authoritarian revival? Greater level of sophistication of some authoritarian regimes. For example, Shabazz, 2008, work shows that the Communist Party of China has allocated hefty budgets to carefully examine and study the reasoning behind the Soviets' downfall, thereby using those lessons to the cause of its survival. The second is the growing internationalization of confrontation between democratic and authoritarian regimes. This has been marked by the readiness of some authoritarian regimes to intervene in internal affairs of others, paralleling the efforts of Western governments to spread democracy. Next, name and briefly explain 4 general characteristics all authoritarian regimes have in common. Understood vis-a-vis such factors as elections, opportunity to change government. Accountability, non-responsive to citizens. Lack of pluralism, power is concentrated. Rule of law, justice is politicized, lack of transparency, limited access to information. Identify 5 major types of authoritarian regimes and provide examples. Explain each in reference to at least 3 of their characteristics. Totalitarian regimes. A form of authoritarian regime, the most notorious, that aims to control everything about the lives of its subject population. Example, Soviet Union, 1917 to 1991, Nazi Germany, 1933 to 1945. One official party, monopoly over means of communication, armed combat, centrally planned economy, prison camps to re-educate the society, and a secret police state. No civil rights, free and fair elections, freedom of thought and consciousness. Theocracy or rule by God. Authoritarian regimes that are strongly religious in character, legitimizing themselves through religion and typically enforcing religious orthodoxy. Example, Saudi Arabia combines monarchical and theocratic forms of rule. The ruling family monopolizes politics, and the king acts as the supreme religious leader. Personalistic dictatorships. A family dictatorship, or hereditary dictatorship, in political science terms a personalistic regime, is a form of dictatorship that occurs in a nominally or formally republican or socialist regime, but operates in practice like an absolute monarchy. Example, the Assads in Syria or Saddam Hussein in Iraq. Bureaucratic authoritarian regimes. A type of authoritarian regime in which the state is controlled more by a group of elites, often military, rather than by a single individual leader. Less focused on the individuals and more on group rule, and rely on an organized bureaucracy, often the military, to run the country. Example, Argentine military in 70s was famous for torture and methods of execution that included throwing dissidents out of helicopters into the Atlantic Ocean. A liberal democracy. A liberal democracy, a hybrid form of regime where countries have reasonably fair elections, but then do little to hold elected leaders accountable. Example, Turkey under Recep Erdogan and Russia under Vladimir Putin. What 2 key arguments does each theory offer to explain authoritarianism and its persistence? Poverty and inequality. State weakness and failure. Political culture theories of authoritarian persistence. Elites and non-democratic rules.